Hey guys, Alex here, and welcome to the Peku Tsunami channel. Today we're replacing all the mounts on my 2004 Honda Civic. But don't worry, I'm not ignoring the Subaru either. Just the only issue is that I'm running out of money, and I already got these guys, so might as well put out some content while I'm at it. Because to be honest, while I was doing this, I had a very hard time looking up some like torque specs and stuff like that, so I just figured, hey, might as well do one consolidated video for you guys, instead of going each individual mount on its own. And I should be finished with it a little after Christmas, so happy belated Christmas. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. The first thing we need to do is remove the air intake in the vehicle. So basically anything with ridges, which are these three items here. To remove these, you're gonna need a 10mm and a long extension, so make sure you have these handy. The reason why we're moving the air filter box is to give you a clear distinction of what the rear mount looks like, because it's kind of hard to see under the vehicle. But you personally don't have to do that if you don't want to go through the extra work. But hey, if you want to, this is an easy way to replace the air filter and clean your throttle body. And to remove the air filter box from the throttle body, it's going to be an 8mm. Alright, cool. Now you remove the air box. Now you can perfectly see your transmission mount. Alright, now the fun begins. Grab your jack and a piece of wood and toss it under the transmission housing. So the trick here is basically you want all the weight on the jack and off the chassis. You can tell by the transmission lifting up a little higher and you're not lifting the vehicle itself. You want to remove all the weight on the mount itself, but make sure you don't go too high because at that point you're just pushing the transmission into the mount and you're making it just as hard for yourself without the jack. There's a sweet spot, but I'm pretty sure you'll find it. Before we knock out the transmission mount, we need to remove this one bracket. It's held in by a 10mm. Now we can get started on the transmission mount itself. If you have any on hand, grab some penetrating fluid and knock out some of the bolts. Depending on your climate, you might need this because they might be rusted over. After that's done, grab your 17mm socket and start knocking out this bolt. This bolt is not going to back out all the way because we actually need to loosen the whole mount after we loosen this bolt here. But it should be easier to remove because all the weight should be off the mount itself. If it's too tough, you might have it too high or too low, so make sure you double check. And the last thing anybody wants is a stripped bolt. Now that's knocked out, grab your deep socket 17mm. After the penetrating fluid, these nuts should be easy to take off.
Damn, dude, these fucking bolts are stupid.
Yeah.
Now the nuts are removed, you should have enough clearance to remove this bolt. So, now it's completely detached from the transmission, and it's hanging on the chassis. Now you want to get your 10mm and remove this blocker here that prevents the actual bracket from getting removed from the vehicle. Once you shimmy off the bracket, now you can clearly see the actual mount itself. Here you can study, see how bad it is, or how good it is. Personally, mine was in really bad condition, so I'm removing this. And to remove this mount, all you need is your 17mm to remove 3 bolts. That's attached to the chassis. Once it's removed, compare the old one to the new one. And comparing the old one to the new one, man, it was definitely time to replace it. As you can see, this mount in particular has these weird rubber moldings. These matter, so make sure you put them in the right orientation before you put them in the vehicle. They have little tabs on the side, so you really can't mess it up. Now we need to do everything in reverse order. So toss in those 3 17mm bolts onto the chassis, with the mount of course. Once that's situated, you can tighten down to 40 foot-pounds. Now you want to toss in the bracket over the motor mount, including the long bolt. And just toss it on there hand tight. You don't want to tighten it up yet. And now that you got the bracket in, you want to jack up your transmission just high enough so the bracket is touching the metal of the transmission. You want no clearance between these 2 points. If there's any clearance, there might be a chance that the bracket might fail and there goes like all the work you've done. So be careful. Once that's situated, tighten those 2 nuts down to 40 foot-pounds. Now before you tighten down that long bolt, drop the transmission. If you don't do this, you can preload the mount and it'll destroy itself. Now that you drop the transmission, now tighten it down to 47 foot-pounds. And that's it, now you finished. 1 out of 4 mounts is done. Now we're going to knock out the side engine mount. It's going to be on the right side of the engine. Before we knock it out, we have to clear off some stuff first, so let's get that situated. So I believe this is the ABS module in the car. So basically you need to kind of like switch this around a little bit because the mount sits right under it. So what that means, basically we need to grab our 10mm socket and start removing the bolts holding this down. There's one 10mm bolt behind the windshield wiper funnel. And there's a 10mm bolt between the engine and the chassis, right below the ABS module. It's a really big pain to get to, so get your 10mm and then edge it out slightly. You don't have to take it off completely. Now we need to remove the connection to the ABS because it's also in the way of the bolts. It's a very odd connection, but to remove this, you need to pull the lever towards the front of the vehicle, and then this allows it to unhinge and then pull up to remove. Now we got one last thing, and it's pretty easy. It's the power steering fluid reservoir. All you need to do is pull it out of the way. Cool. Grab your jack and that piece of wood, and now you want to jack up the oil pan. But be careful because there might be a chance if you put too much pressure you'll crack the pan, so be very, 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 very careful. Alright, cool. Now that you finally got it jacked up just enough to take off the weight, now grab your 17mm socket and take off these 3 nuts. And if you're having any trouble, use some penetrating fluid because it's definitely useful here. After removing the bracket, that was the only thing holding the mount to the engine, so that bracket should come right out. Now we're going to remove the actual mount itself. The mount is held in by 3 14mm bolts. It definitely helps when you have a swivel adapter, so if you can, go grab one. Now that it's finally out, oh man, yeah, it was a good thing that I'm going to replace this one. This is a very good explanation why everything was vibrating so hard in the car. And just like the last mount, make sure you compare the old mount to the new mount, just to make sure there's no differences. Now let's just reverse order, toss in the motor mount into the chassis, and tighten the bolts down to 40 foot-pounds. Now toss the bracket on. You want to make sure, again, just like the last one, that the bracket metal is touching the metal on the engine. You don't want any space between the bracket and the engine. Now put these hand tight as far as you can and then lower the engine. Now you want to tighten down to 40 foot-pounds. And same story as last one, do not preload the bolts, cause early mount failure. And that's it for the engine mount. So, tighten down your ABS module hand tight and then put the connection back on. And don't forget the power steering fluid reservoir and you're good to go. 2 down, 2 to go. Now that we've tackled both side mounts, now it's time to tackle the rear motor mount. So to tackle the rear mount, it's the hardest one at all 4 of them. So what we gotta do now is jack the car up, put on some jack stands, and we're going right under it. So there are some clearance issues to get to the 3 bolts for your rear mount. These are blocked by your actual piping for your exhaust. So now, once you got everything jacked up, you want to remove the mounts for the exhaust, which include the ones right next to your mount and the one next to your muffler. So if you can, grab a friend, maybe help you out a little bit, or it's gonna be a little extra work for yourself. These little rubber mounts kind of just slide off these pegs. So if you can do that, it's cool. If not, maybe use pliers. And don't be afraid to ask for more help if you need it. Now that you slightly drop the exhaust piping, now you can get your jack and that piece of wood and put it under the transmission housing and kind of like we did before, slightly raise it up. Now slightly move over the exhaust piping to get to these 3 14mm bolts. Again, having a swivel adapter definitely helps out. The only reason why I say this is because the pipe is actually pretty heavy, and just having that extra leverage, just to shove that pipe to the left a little more, can definitely help you out when you're trying to move these bolts. These all vary in size, so make sure you know which one goes to which. Now comes the tough part. Grab your 17mm deep socket and a long extension, because now you're going to try and break the bolts hanging on from the mount to the engine itself. I personally use a metal pipe with my setup to get more leverage to remove these bolts. They're pretty hard to take off without a power tool, but it's totally possible by hand. Alright, here's the fun part. If you're really good at puzzles, you're going to be really good at this. So, you got to somehow shimmy this mount between your CV axle and the chassis. So, I personally didn't get a chance to record this because I can't record while trying to shimmy it out, but I had to completely flip it sideways and then flip it upside down to get it between the CV axle and the chassis itself. So it's possible, but it's going to take some time. Once you finally got it out, now you gotta take off the bolt that holds the mount to the bracket. Having some friends helps out a lot. And if you don't have any at the moment, you can also get a bench vise. But again, power tools would be specifically helpful in this particular problem. And after finally taking off this bolt, you can see all the damage and all the vibrations were caused by this one mount completely destroyed. But be sure to find out the correct orientation of the mount itself before you remove the bolt so you don't get confused. Yep. These 3 bolts, just like the last ones, are also different sizes, so make sure you know which goes where. And same story as last time, make sure you double check your mounts. And this mount being this damaged was definitely another factor of why my cabin was vibrating so much. I mean, look at that damage, it's terrible. Alright, you want to put that bolt hand tight. Now, slide back under your car and toss it back into the vehicle. And just like before, everything's reverse order. So, shimmy that mount back into its original position. So what I do is I put the bracket in first. While the bracket's in, I shift it to the left so the bolts align, but the mount itself has the holes facing against the firewall. Once I get everything in position, I twist the mount down to align the bolt holes in the bottom. It's a really tight space, but I'm pretty sure you guys can get it handled. Unless you want to take the engine out, but that's at your own discretion. And toss in those 3 bolts hand tight. Now, grab the other 3 bolts, which are varying sizes, and toss those in as well. And again, hand tight. Now that you got all the bolts perfectly aligned, now you can tighten down the bolts. The bottom one's tightened to 43 foot-pounds, and the bracket to the engine is 47 foot-pounds. Now that you tighten those 6 bolts, you should now be able to drop down the engine from the oil pan to tighten the last one. This is the long bolt that connects from the bracket to the mount itself, and that one is also 47 foot-pounds. I personally couldn't get to it because my torque wrench is too big, so I tightened it as tight as possible by using the other bolts as references. Again, the 3rd PSA, do not over tighten that mount before you put it in because again you will preload it and it will destroy itself. So make sure you drop the jack before you tighten this one down. Great, everything's finished. So now go back, toss in those pegs into those hangers and you should be good to go. And that was the hardest one, and that's 3 out of 4. This one's the easiest one of every single one we just did, so this should be a walk in the park. There are 3 bolts in total, 1 that holds a chassis to the mount and the 2 that holds a mount to the engine. So, get your jack and the piece of wood again for the last time and jack up the transmission spot. Now you want to grab your 17mm and you want to remove the bolt holding down the mount to the chassis. Now that's removed, it's actually connected to a nut that's actually removable, so make sure you hang on to that so it doesn't fall off. Now grab that same 17mm socket and take off the 2 bolts holding the mount to the engine. And from there, it's just an easy swap. Toss back the mount with those 2 17mm bolts and torque them down to 47 foot-pounds. Now that's situated, grab the long bolt and that nut. So the nut has a little tab that goes in a hole that holds it down while you're tightening it down, so make sure you hand tighten it all the way. Once it's hand tightened, you can't go any farther. Now drop the engine from the jack and tighten it down to 47 foot-pounds. And that's it, guys. 4 out of 4. Good job. You got this far. Should have smooth sailing, no issues whatsoever. So, again, if you like what you saw, please like and subscribe. If you got any comments or any discretions, please comment down below. Let me know. I'll definitely fix it, no problem. And yeah, that's it, guys. See you guys in the next one. Later.